There comes a time in life when you start to ask yourself some hard questions. Questions like, why am I still doing this? Or, does this really matter anymore? And for me, one of those questions was, why do I care so much about what my church thinks? Now, don't get me wrong. Faith is important. It's been the foundation of my life for as long as I can remember. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was spending more time worrying about fitting into the expectations of my church community than I was focusing on what truly mattered: my own relationship with God, my peace of mind, and my happiness. Maybe you've felt that way too. Maybe you've sat in a pew, listening to someone talk about how you should be living your life, and thought, but that doesn't feel right for me. Or maybe you've held back from expressing yourself, your doubts, your questions, even your joys, because you were afraid of what others might say. Well, today, I want to talk about why I finally stopped caring what my church thinks, and why that might be the best decision you ever make too. For years, I lived under this invisible pressure, the pressure to conform, to show up every Sunday with a smile, to nod along even when something didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to be seen as the difficult one, the questioning one, or worse, the one who didn't really believe. But here's the thing: faith isn't about performance. It's not about saying the right words or following every rule to the letter. And yet, so many of us, especially those of us who've been in the church for decades, feel like we have to play a role. We worry about what the pastor will think, what the deacons will say, what the ladies' group will whisper about over coffee. And that weight, it gets heavy. I remember the exact moment it hit me. I was sitting in a Bible study listening to someone talk about how true Christians should behave, what they should wear, how they should vote, even what hobbies were acceptable. And I thought, since when did faith become about checking boxes? That was the day I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation for how I lived my faith. My relationship with God was just that, mine. And if someone else didn't approve of the way I prayed, the questions I asked, or the choices I made, well, that was their problem, not mine. Letting go of that fear, the fear of judgment, the fear of not being good enough, was like taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. I started to focus on what truly nourished my spirit, rather than what kept me in everyone else's good graces. I stopped forcing myself to attend every single church event out of obligation. I stopped pretending to agree with things that didn't align with my heart. And most importantly, I stopped apologizing for being me, flaws, doubts, and all. Now, this doesn't mean I abandoned my faith. In fact, it was the opposite. By stepping away from the noise of other people's opinions, I found a deeper, more personal connection to what I believed. And that, my friends, was worth everything. But this journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments of loneliness, and yes, moments of pushback from people who didn't understand. And that's what we'll talk about next: how to navigate those tough moments with grace and confidence. Because once you start living for yourself instead of for the approval of others, everything changes. And trust me, you won't want to go back. When I first started pulling back from the expectations of my church, I'll admit, it wasn't easy. There's a certain comfort in belonging, in knowing exactly where you fit. And when you step away from that, even just a little, it can feel like you're standing on shaky ground. I remember the first Sunday I decided not to go to church. Not because I was sick or traveling, but simply because I needed a break, a quiet morning to reflect, to pray in my own way, without the rituals and routines. And you know what? I felt guilty, really guilty, like I'd broken some unspoken rule. But then something surprising happened. That quiet morning at home, with my coffee and my thoughts, became one of the most peaceful spiritual moments I'd had in years. No rushing to get ready, no small talk in the lobby, no sitting through a sermon that didn't speak to me. Just me and God, exactly as I was. And that's when I realized I wasn't losing my faith. I was reclaiming it. Of course, not everyone understood. Some folks noticed when I wasn't at services as often. A few even reached out, sometimes with concern, sometimes with thinly veiled disapproval. "We missed you Sunday," they'd say, with that tone that really meant, "Where were you?" At first, I'd make excuses. "Oh, I wasn't feeling well," or "I had company." But then I thought, why? Why was I lying to avoid their judgment? So I started answering honestly. I needed some time to myself, or I've been exploring different ways to worship. And you know what? Some people didn't like that. They'd frown or change the subject, or even try to gently, or not so gently, correct me. But here's the thing. Their discomfort wasn't my responsibility. I wasn't being disrespectful. I wasn't attacking their beliefs. I was just living my life. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is that faith doesn't have to look the same for everyone. For some, it's Sunday services and Wednesday night Bible studies. For others, it's long walks in nature, journaling, or volunteering in ways that feel meaningful. And none of those are wrong. They're just different. I started asking myself, what feeds my soul? What makes me feel closer to God? Sometimes it was going to church, but only when I truly wanted to be there, not out of obligation. Other times, it was sitting on my porch with a well-loved devotional or listening to a podcast that challenged me in new ways. And the more I honored that, the lighter I felt. The less I worried about what others thought, the more my faith became something alive and personal, not just a habit I'd kept for decades. Now, I won't pretend this shift didn't come with fears. There's a nagging voice that whispers, if you're not all in, does it still count? Or worse, what if people think you've lost your way? But here's what I've come to believe. God isn't keeping score. Faith isn't about attendance records or how many committees you serve on. It's about the heart. And if your heart is seeking, questioning, growing, even if it's in a direction that doesn't fit the mold, that's not something to fear. That's something to celebrate. The real turning point came when I stopped explaining myself, when I stopped saying, I'm sorry, but before sharing my thoughts or choices. I started owning my spiritual journey without apology, not defiantly, but quietly, confidently. And something amazing happened. The people who truly cared about me, not just my role in the church, stayed. They listened. They even asked questions. And the ones who only cared about my compliance, well, they faded into the background. And that was okay, because here's the truth. You don't owe anyone your conformity. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's idea of faith. And in the next part, I'll share the most surprising and beautiful thing that happened when I finally let go of those expectations. Because sometimes the freedom you find on the other side is better than you ever imagined. You know, when I started this journey, letting go of the weight of other people's expectations, I thought the biggest reward would be peace. And don't get me wrong, that peace was real. Waking up on a Sunday morning and knowing I could choose how to spend it without guilt or fear, that was a gift. But what I didn't expect was how much deeper my faith would become once I stopped performing it for others. For so long, I'd treated my spirituality like a well-kept house, everything in its place, presentable, tidy. But faith isn't meant to be tidy. It's messy. It's full of questions, doubts, and moments of raw honesty. And when I finally gave myself permission to embrace that, when I stopped editing my thoughts to fit what was acceptable, I discovered a richer, more real connection to God than I'd ever had before. I remember one evening, sitting outside under the stars, just talking to God like I would to an old friend. No fancy words, no scripted prayers, just me saying, some days I'm not even sure what I believe anymore, but I'm here, and I'm trying. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of being fully seen, fully known, and still fully loved. That's the thing about authenticity. It doesn't push God away. It draws you closer. Now, I won't sugarcoat it. This journey changed some of my relationships. A few people from church drifted away. The invitations to certain events dried up. At first, that stung, but over time, I realized something important. The people who stepped back were often the ones who only knew me as the reliable church lady. They didn't really know me, the me who loved gritty questions, who needed space, who didn't always have it all together. But the ones who stayed, those relationships deepened in ways I never expected. Turns out, when you stop hiding, you give others permission to do the same. I'd have conversations with friends who'd whisper, "I felt that way too," but I was too afraid to say it. We'd laugh, we'd cry, we'd wrestle with big questions together, and that felt like real community. Here's the beautiful part. Once I stopped worrying about what my church thought, I got to decide what my faith looked like. Maybe it meant lighting a candle and sitting in silence instead of singing hymns. Maybe it meant reading a book that challenged everything I'd been taught and discovering God in the questions, not just the answers. Maybe it meant serving in ways that felt true to my heart, even if it wasn't an official church ministry. And the more I leaned into that freedom, the more I realized faith isn't a set of rules, it's a relationship. And relationships grow when they're honest, when they're given room to breathe. If you're watching this and thinking, but what if I'm not ready? What if I lose too much? I get it. This isn't about burning bridges or making grand statements. It's about small, quiet choices to honor yourself. Maybe it starts with skipping one event you dread, or saying, I see it differently, when you'd normally just nod along. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to give yourself permission to begin. And here's what surprised me most. Letting go of what my church thought didn't make me lose my faith. It made me find it, not in a building, or a doctrine, or someone else's expectations, but in the quiet, everyday moments where God felt real to me. So if you've been carrying the weight of other people's opinions, I hope you'll set it down. Not with anger, not with rebellion, but with the quiet confidence that you, exactly as you are enough. And if you've walked this path too, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Let's remind each other that we're not alone. Until next time, friends, here's to living a faith that's truly your own. Do subscribe to keep the circle growing.